Last month marked 20 years since Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans and the Gulf Coast. Katrina was the costliest natural disaster in U.S. history and killed close to 1,400 people. Even today, residents are still recovering from its effects and understand that it could happen again. Scientists are also concerned as climate change is creating stronger and more destructive hurricanes.
We know that hurricanes are not necessarily becoming more frequent. That is, there aren't necessarily more hurricanes out there. But what hurricanes we do have and we are experiencing on the mainland here in the United States and indeed across the rest of the world are becoming more severe. What do I mean by that? Well, there's a few different ways that the characteristics of hurricanes are changing in response to climate change. One of the ways is very simple. It's related to sea level rise. So we know that around the world, especially along the east and Gulf Coast of the United States, sea levels are starting to increase quite dramatically, and they've been increasing for the last 100 years. What that means is that as these hurricanes come on shore, they're bringing higher water levels with them, which can threaten infrastructure, in particular coastal region.
That's Daniel Gilford, a climate scientist at the nonprofit science news organization Climate Central.
Another way that hurricane characteristics are becoming more severe is that we know that a warmer atmosphere is a wetter atmosphere. So atmosphere is becoming more moist as we increase the atmospheric temperature due to human-caused climate change. There's more moisture in the atmosphere, and that means that hurricanes can rain out more effectively. There's more water coming out of hurricanes now, and that is a real big problem because not only are we dealing with storm surge as a hurricane comes on land, but we can see intense, significant rainfall impacts due to these hurricanes.
Storm surge can cause dangerous flooding and happens when there's a quick rise in water levels during a hurricane and strong winds push the water inland. Additionally, hotter temperatures cause more evaporation, and as hurricanes move across warm oceans, they pull in extra heat and water vapor, fueling stronger, more destructive storms. As a result, we've seen a sharp rise in Category 4 and 5 hurricanes than 30 or 40 years ago.
Coinciding with that, we see that there's an increase in the amount of billion-dollar disasters that we have associated with hurricanes. There's been consistently more hurricane damage over the last 10 years than there was, for instance, in the 30 years leading up to it. There's just more and more damaging associated with these storms. Part of that is related to increased vulnerability, especially there's more people living in vulnerable places now to these hurricane impacts, but part of that is also increases in hurricane destructiveness.
According to the last census, 94.7 million Americans live in coastline regions. This is nearly 30% of the overall U.S. population. Of that group, 60.2 million live along the Atlantic Ocean or the Gulf of Mexico, two areas that are the most vulnerable to hurricanes. As these storms have intensified, there's been some action taken to make structures stronger and more resilient. However, Jeff Schlegelmilch, director of the National Center for Disaster Preparedness at the Columbia Climate School at Columbia University, believes there's still a long way to go.
In Florida, after Hurricane Andrew in the 1990s, a number of codes were changed, sort of recognizing the vulnerability from that. And some of it is more proactive. But so one of the first ones are building codes. How we build our homes, how we build our infrastructure, where we build it, if you're going to build it in a hurricane-prone area, if you're going to build in an area prone to storm surge, you have to have certain things in place, right? So the building codes require that by law. In a lot of other cases, we see codes maybe not being put in place, not being pushed forward, because it has this very real effect of making it more expensive in the near term, right? It costs more to build a home that will withstand a hurricane than to build one that won't. And so that creates some economic pressures that affect growth, that affect things like affordable housing. And if you're in an environment that is on top of all that hostile to this notion of climate change, you can get a lot of pressures against putting in those types of regulations and things like that.
Building codes vary across the country, but in hurricane-prone regions, they often require stronger materials for framing and roofing, enhanced foundation and structural requirements, and adherence to strict wind-resistant standards. And while investing in resilience is expensive, it's much cheaper to spend the money now rather than after the damage is done. Some estimates say spending $1 pre-disaster saves you $6 after, with some experts placing that number as high as $15. These measures can make a big difference, but in many places, they're no longer enough. Along coasts hit hard by sea level rise, some experts are pushing a controversial strategy called managed retreat.
One of the more controversial areas is this idea of managed retreat. There was actually a study, but it was looking really globally at the economics of either shoring up areas, making them more resilient to storms and sea level rise and all these different hazards. And the other is to say, pack it up and move it inland, right? And what that study found, and what we find time and time again, is that neither solution is actually economically viable. You have some areas that are so built up with so much infrastructure in the pathways, it's actually better to shore them up, build flood walls and various types of infrastructure. Others are just in such hazardous areas that it just is not economically viable to protect them. You have to move them.
Managed retreat also overlooks the human cost of leaving. For families who've lived in coastal areas for generations, being forced to move from the only place you've ever called home can be deeply traumatic.
The one thing that we lose with all of this, though, is the human side. We have areas where families have lived for generations. Some have very significant cultural ties and things like that. Those don't get caught up in those economic analyses. So there are a lot of very innovative solutions that have to do with the built environment of things that we can do if we can afford them. But there's also a lot on the social environment in terms of keeping people together, keeping communities together, staying connected with where they've lived for generations. That also has a value that we don't necessarily take into account.
One notable example of managed retreat is the Isle de Jean Charles in Louisiana. The island, which was a historical homeland of a Native American tribe, was forced to relocate after years of rising sea levels and coastal erosion. After getting funding from the U.S. government, the community successfully resettled to a new isle 40 miles away. While there have only been a few instances of these domestic relocations, that number will soon grow if climate change continues to worsen.
There are areas everywhere, certainly in the U.S. along the Gulf Coast and low-lying areas of Louisiana. You have some communities that are at risk of disappearing as a result of this, and even major built-up areas like Miami and Florida are extraordinarily exposed to sea level rise and to some of the impacts from this. So there are some very tough questions there in terms of what to do.
So, what can we do? With climate change occurring on such a large scale, you may feel powerless when hurricanes and other natural disasters happen. And though we can't control the timing or impact of these events, there are factors that are in our control.
The short-term solution is to go to ready.gov and prepare yourself by having you and your household prepared for the worst of hurricane disasters if you are sort of in the range of where hurricanes could be. Further inland communities now should be prepared. If you live along the eastern Gulf Coast for hurricane impacts, I think that's critical. So go to ready.gov and prepare yourself. The other thing is sort of a longer term goal, which is that we need to continue to see this as an opportunity to talk about how our climate is changing and affecting their communities. We know these storms are now more severe because of human-caused climate change. We are increasing the temperature of our atmosphere and oceans, and that's affecting these intense events and making them worse. But we need to be having those conversations where we talk with people that we know, that we love, that we care about these impacts, so we can collectively together work towards solutions to making them less terrible for the communities that we care about.
Other actions Gilford recommends include cutting back on carbon emissions by driving and flying less and using fewer fossil fuels. We can also push for change by voting in the upcoming midterms for political candidates who prioritize the environment and climate change policy. Looking ahead, while some communities will have the money and resources to adapt, others will be left behind.
Unfortunately, what we're seeing right now is a little bit of a reversal in the U.S., where we're seeing a lot of those preparedness programs being cut or being eliminated. And so it's going to be sort of the haves and the have-nots in terms of who can afford to be resilient, who can afford to put these preparedness mechanisms and infrastructure in place. There's a saying that disasters don't discriminate, and I can tell you the data shows time and time again they absolutely do discriminate. You can have the same disaster hit the same city and communities that are more socially isolated, more socioeconomically deprived, which correlates with a lot of times with race, with gender, all sorts of things based on historical policies, have extraordinarily different experiences in their capacity to cope, their ability to marshal resources and access resources after a disaster. So we can't just look at the exposure to the hazard. We have to look at the ability to recover from that. And that's where we truly get an effective and lasting recovery.
To find out more about Daniel Gilford, Jeff Schlegelmilch, and all our featured guests, visit viewpointsradio.org. For more behind the scenes, check out Viewpoints Radio on X, Facebook, and Instagram. This segment was written and produced by Grace Galante. Our executive producer is Amira Zaveri. Our studio manager is Jason Dickey. I'm Gary Price.